Joining us another week. And you had identified in last week's Leger poll this demographic shift that seemed to continue this week with the Conservatives closing the gap with the NDP with women and voters on Vancouver Island, and they've extended their lead slightly over the NDP with the youngest voters aged 18 to 34, and in Metro Vancouver, where there are so many ridings. I mean, how do you explain what's been going on there with this shift?
It is really interesting. So our latest numbers show a slight shift in the voter questions, or horse race that we call it, where the Conservatives are now in the lead to the tune of 46% to 43% for the NDP. The Greens are stalled at 10, haven't really moved in this campaign. But what is interesting is, where's the support coming from and why? And when you break down the numbers, as you alluded to, we do have kind of a surprising trend in this election, and that is women voters are supporting the Conservative Party and John Rustad in particular, and same with the 18 to 34-year-olds. And traditionally, right-wing parties don't get massive support. Like the gap between, for example, on males versus females is 49% support for males and 42% for females. So still a little bit of a gap, but usually you'd see more like a 15-point gap on a right-wing party that's going into an election. And same with youth. We have almost a neck and neck tie between the numbers on that front. The 18 to 34-year-olds, it's 47% support who would vote for Conservatives tomorrow, and it's 49% for 35 to 54-year-olds. So that's a number that we typically don't see. Youth typically tend to lean centrist to left-wing parties in support. So what's happening behind those numbers? I mean, maybe a good example was I saw the ad yesterday that Rustad and his party had put out, and it had his wife talking about him as a person and how kind of warm and caring he is. And it was actually very a heartfelt ad that really tried to show a softer side of Rustad that I think is working with the voters, is I believe what's happening. When you have those demographics working the way that it is, it shows that he's not seen as a right extremist. He's seen as more of a moderate, and the results are proving that in the numbers.
At the same time, Rustad trails David Eby very badly, both on the question of who'd be the best fit as premier and in terms of their favorability ratings. So can the Conservatives win or continue to maintain a lead if Rustad remains so unpopular, at least relative to Eby?
Relative to Eby, yes, Eby's picked by 45% as the best fit for premier. Conservatives at 38%, John Rustad at 38%. So there is a gap relative to the voter intent. A couple things here. One is we have seen a move to the right in Canada. If you look at Poilievre and his party, the Conservatives Party of Canada, that has also gone neck or hand in hand, if you will. If you look at the correlation between a provincial Conservative voter, different party, same name, it's about 90%. So if you're voting Conservative federally, you're voting Conservative in BC as well. So all that momentum that's been created over the past year, the policy shift, the anti kind of wokeness sentiment that's circulating, that coupled with some anti-immigration sentiment, that has been growing in Canada. And I think the trend in of itself is there, and people support the trend, and they're not as concerned about the party leader as they have been maybe in past elections.
Interesting. So is there a precedent for something like this
Not that I
where
can remember. It's really, if you look back over the past couple of weeks, we've heard more coming out of John Rustad in the last 2 weeks than probably the last 2 years combined. Like he's finally, British Columbians are getting to know him a little bit better. And it's not all positive because he does have an equal number who say they have a worsening impression than those who say that they have an improved perception, but they're still holding firm in voter support. So despite him getting better known and having some negative numbers there, they're still, you know, commanding a pretty decent lead in the polls.
on the issue of issues and priority issues for voters, which I always find interesting as well. Um, Housing affordability, healthcare remain far and away the two biggest issues, and they're basically neck and neck up there at the top. and the economy is sort of in there around cost of living and some of the other things. Interesting, though, when you asked people about which party you think could best address these priority issues, you get the NDP with a significant lead, double-digit lead roughly, over the Conservatives on housing affordability and healthcare. But then you get the Conservatives with this massive lead over the NDP on the economy. So
Yeah, it is. It
you
is
know people are
interesting.
divided.
There's
Yeah.
a couple things happening there. One is, yes, housing prices are it's still number one. It's been there for ever since COVID dissipated as the number one issue. Inflation dissipating a little bit, dropped by 3 or 4 points in the last month. And even housing prices have dropped from 27% in August to 22% now. And what is rising in its place is healthcare concern, going from 17% to 21% in terms of the most important issue. We've got economy and the environment and crime and the opioid crisis all slowly creeping up a little bit. And then you look at voters and which issues they care about. An interesting thing happens. You have Conservative Party supporters saying that healthcare is the number one issue over housing prices and affordability. So it's the priorities of the different voter segments are a little bit different. And you're right, they are scoring differently too.
Hmm. So then we see that translating perhaps into how the parties and the leaders themselves approach these issues. So, for example, we're seeing Rusted trying to link housing policy and healthcare policy back to the economy and saying, hey, we need to grow the economy to increase wages so that people can afford to buy homes and that we can raise the revenue to support an expansion of healthcare services. Whereas EB is sticking very closely to this, I guess, idea that they will invest in healthcare and housing as a government, and accusing Rusted of making cuts in those areas.
Yeah, that is it is the theme, and I think on that front, there's a believability issue that's happening with the NDP because we've heard that same message from Adrian Dix for months and months now that we're hiring doctors, we're hiring nurses, and yet just a few short weeks ago, the doctors in Surrey Memorial were all banding together and saying we're in crisis mode and we're in emergency status mode. And so I think people are not fully believing what the NDP is doing on that front, and it remains one of their most vulnerable areas. I mean, they're the ones that have been in power for such a long period of time, so whatever's happening in healthcare is sticking to them. Whereas the voters on the Conservative side, it's not yet tried and proven, so they're giving maybe more credence to a different approach. Try something different because you'll get a different result.
Okay. Well, will we talk again in a week, Steve? What will you be watching for? Because we'll be very close to the election by next week.
Yes, we're getting closer. It's October already, and we have this momentum thing. And I talked to Lori about it, your other reporters, that there's this momentum thing that's happening. It's partly revealed in the numbers, but there's also kind of a feeling in the air that the Conservatives have the momentum. So what I'll be looking for next week is that going in the same direction? Does momentum continue? And if it does, yeah, they're going to be a formidable force on election day when it comes to the vote. And so I'll keep my eyes open for, is momentum still there? And is there any shift in favorability ratings? Because you're right, behind the scenes, it is a bit of an odd situation where you have the voter intent where it is, and yet the favorability ratings telling us something slightly different. So we'll be looking for changes in there.
Any advice for the leaders? Where do you think they should be placing their bets?
Well, I think they already are doing this. They usually say pay close attention to the issues that are important, but you can see right away that Evie's doing that. He's been talking about housing for a year now. It's like every other week there's an announcement about some housing initiative. So I think he must have read our reports loud and clear to see that in its place. And as I say, it's an issue of credibility, believability, and something new. If the NDP can throw something new at the equation that they haven't said before, they stand a stronger chance of being listened to. And as I said, Rustad has an open book. He's new to this space, and he's going to propose new things, and maybe that's the thing that the election hinges on.
Right. Well, we got the Green Party platform yesterday. Hopefully, we'll get the NDP and Conservative platforms before we meet again next week, and see how people respond to that. All right. Thanks for your time, Steve.
Yeah, thanks so much, Harold. We'll talk next week.